We settle in now, drifting back to a time when the California coast was defined not by the noise of industry, but by the deep, rhythmic breathing of the Pacific Ocean. Before the world rushed in, San Francisco Bay was a vast, empty mirror, reflecting only the grey fog and the circling gulls. It was a sleepy outpost, home to fewer than 1,000 souls, existing in a quiet equilibrium with the wind and the tides. But deep in the interior, in the cold water of the American River, a single discovery had been made that would shatter this silence forever. To understand the noise that followed, we must first understand the quiet that preceded it. We begin our journey in the stillness of January and the promise of gold. The year 1849 did not begin with a shout. It began in a whisper, carried slowly across a landscape that had not yet been measured or mapped. In our modern age, news travels at the speed of light, circling the globe in an instant. But in the winter of 1849, information moved only as fast as a horse could gallop or a ship could sail against the wind. The discovery of gold at Sutter's mill had happened months prior, yet for much of the world, and indeed for many in California itself, the news was nothing more than a rumor, a phantom story told by travelers seeking attention in dim taverns. The local population viewed these early reports with profound skepticism. They had seen the land yield timber and hides, but the idea of riverbanks glittering with wealth seemed like a fable. Life continued in its established grooves. The few merchants in the small coastal towns did not yet see the tsunami of demand that was forming on the horizon. Let us consider the humble shovel. In these early weeks of January, a shovel was simply a tool for gardening or clearing mud. It sat in the corner of a general store, priced at perhaps $1, waiting for a hand that needed to dig a foundation or plant a row of beans. The iron was cold, the handle smooth and unhurried. There was no desperation attached to it, no inflation driven by panic. It was just an object, resting in the quiet dust of a supply shelf. In the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, the winter air was crisp and biting. The camps that existed were small, isolated pockets of humanity, swallowed by the immense scale of the pine forest. The work was slow. Men moved with the deliberate pace of those who had nowhere else to be. There was no competition yet, no jostling for space along the riverbanks. A miner could stand alone for miles, hearing only the rush of the water and the wind moving through the needles of the sugar pines. The labor was solitary. It was a time of heavy wool coats and cold fingers, of breath visible in the morning air, and of long, silent evenings spent watching the fire consume the damp wood. The landscape itself held a kind of innocence. The rivers ran clear, their beds undisturbed by the violence of hydraulic mining that would come in later years. The gravel bars were intact, shifting only with the natural flow of the season's rain. To stand on the bank of the American River in January was to stand in a cathedral of nature, where the only commerce was the exchange of oxygen and water. The gold lay hidden beneath the silt, heavy and ancient, waiting in the dark. But silence, by its nature, is fragile. While the mountains slept under the winter snow, the signal was beginning to drift outward. It moved slowly at first, like smoke on a still day, traveling down the valleys and toward the coast. Letters were being written by candlelight, folded into envelopes, and placed into the holds of ships bound for the east coast. These letters carried the first grains of truth, the first tangible proof that the rumors were real. The world was still quiet, but the mechanism of change had been engaged. As the month drew to a close, the news began its long, slow voyage across the oceans, destined to ignite a fire in the minds of men thousands of miles away. The news reached the eastern seaboard, not as a shout, but as a persistent murmur that refused to fade. In the cold parlors of New England and the busy markets of New York, the skepticism of January began to dissolve, replaced by a strange, magnetic pull. This was the onset of what history calls gold fever. But in February 1849, it felt less like a disease and more like a sudden clarity of purpose. Men looked at their plows, their ledgers, and their grey winter streets, and saw a different future shimmering on the other side of the continent. The reaction was not chaotic flight, but organized, methodical mobilization. In small towns across the east, neighbors gathered in quiet rooms to form mining companies. These were not faceless corporations, but groups of friends and cousins pooling their life savings to purchase a shared destiny. They drafted constitutions by lamplight, pledging loyalty and shared profits. Some even designed matching uniforms with brass buttons, believing that order and discipline would conquer the wilderness. It was a time of serious logistical calculation. They were not just packing bags. They were building microeconomies, calculating exactly how many pounds of flour and how many ounces of lead would be needed to sustain life in a land they had never seen. The economy of departure began to warp the established markets. The price of passage around Cape Horn, the long, dangerous sea route, began its vertical climb. Ticket prices that had once been stable now doubled, then tripled, as the laws of supply and demand exerted their unyielding pressure. But beyond the tickets, there was the matter of sustenance. Suddenly, the humble barrel of salted beef became a currency of its own. Hardtack, dried beans, and preserved meats vanished from the shelves. The entire eastern seaboard began to pivot toward the preservation of calories, turning the mundane necessity of lunch into a strategic asset. The air in the warehouses grew thick with the smell of brine and curing salt, as thousands of barrels were packed to survive the equator's heat. This was the macroeconomic shift of the era, a sudden, desperate valuation of anything that could endure a 6-month voyage. Yet, amidst this logistical flurry, there was a profound emotional stillness. We find this preserved in the diaries of the time. In the final nights of February, men sat at their desks for the last time, the house quiet around them. They recorded not just their hopes for wealth, but the heavy, tangible weight of departure. They looked at the walls of their homes, the faces of their sleeping children, and the familiar streets they might never walk again. These were moments of deep introspection, where the silence of the room spoke louder than the promise of gold. The decision to leave was a severance, a cutting of ties that had held families together for generations. While this mobilization churned in the east, the Sierra Nevada remained locked in the deep freeze of late winter. The mountains were indifferent to the preparations being made 3,000 miles away. The snow lay heavy and silent on the granite peaks, burying the gold deep beneath layers of white. The rivers flowed under ice, guarding their secrets for a few weeks longer. The stage was set. The actors were moving into position, but the curtain had not yet risen. The great movement was about to begin, drifting out with the tide, not across the land, but across the vast, indifferent silence of the ocean. As the North American continent vanished behind the stern, the travelers entered a suspended state of existence. The journey around the Horn was not a sprint. It was a marathon of patience, stretching over 15,000 miles of open water. For the men crowded onto these vessels, the month of March became a study in monotony. The horizon was a relentless, unbroken circle of grey, shifting only slightly with the mood of the Atlantic. Day after day, the view remained the same. A vast, breathing emptiness that made the destination feel less like a place and more like a dream. The ocean was not a highway, but a wilderness of its own, vast and indifferent to the small wooden shells bobbing upon its surface. Life below decks was a compression of humanity. The Argonauts, as they began to call themselves, were packed into berths that offered barely enough room to turn over. The air in these confined spaces took on a permanent texture, a heavy, humid blend of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the pervasive, sharp scent of tar and oakum used to seal the hull. There was no privacy here, only the constant, creaking symphony of the ship's timbers working against the waves. It was a world of wood and water, where the sun was a rare visitor, and the dampness was a permanent resident, seeping into clothes and bedding, until nothing ever felt truly dry. The passage of time was marked not by events, but by the slow depletion of supplies. The romantic notion of the sea voyage quickly gave way to the culinary reality of the era. The diet was a cycle of salted beef and hardtack, biscuits baked so hard they had to be broken with a hammer or soaked in coffee to be edible. The sensory experience of eating became a chore of endurance. The flavor was of salt and dust, a dry, brittle taste that lingered on the tongue long after the meal was finished. Men found themselves fantasizing not about gold, but about a fresh apple or a slice of soft, warm bread. In this closed ecosystem, the value of objects began to shift dramatically. On land, water is often an afterthought, flowing freely from a pump or a stream. But in the middle of the Atlantic, fresh water became the most precious currency on board. The water stored in wooden casks often grew stagnant, taking on a ropey texture and a foul smell after weeks in the hold. A single cup of clear, sweet water, free from the taste of wood or algae, became a fantasy. Men would dream of the cool wells they left behind in New England. The price of water was not measured in dollars, for there was none to buy, but in the discipline required to make a pint last through the heat of the day. The sound of the water ladle hitting the bottom of the bucket was the most attentive moment of the afternoon. To combat the crushing weight of boredom, the men turned to the few books they had brought. A single copy of the Bible or a worn novel would be passed from hand to hand, read and reread, until the pages were soft as cloth and the bindings fell apart. They discussed the characters as if they were mutual friends, debating plot points simply to hear the sound of a human voice that wasn't complaining about the food or the weather. They watched the wake of the ship, the white foam churning and disappearing, measuring their progress in inches against an ocean that seemed infinite. But while these thousands drifted in the slow silence of the sea, bobbing like corks toward the equator, a different movement was beginning to stir on the solid ground of the continent. The winter snows were receding, and the great overland trails were beginning to dry. The sea had its silence, but the land was about to find its voice. While the Argonauts at sea stared at a static horizon, the land route was becoming a river of motion. In April, the town of Independence, Missouri, transformed from a quiet trading post into the staging ground for the greatest migration in American history. If the sea voyage was defined by silence, the overland trail began with a roar. Thousands of wagons, painted in bright blues and reds, clogged the muddy streets, their canvas covers glowing white in the spring sun. The air was thick with the sounds of livestock, the lowing of oxen, the braying of mules, and the sharp crack of whips testing the air. It was a chaotic symphony of departure, a gathering of humanity pressing against the edge of the known world, waiting for the grass to turn green enough to sustain the journey ahead. Once the wheels began to turn, the chaos settled into a grinding, repetitive rhythm. The sensory experience of the trail was dominated by the earth itself. On dry days, the dust rose in choking clouds, coating faces and lungs in a fine, gritty powder that tasted of alkali and dry soil. On wet days, the world dissolved into mud, a thick, sucking clay that grabbed at wheels and boots with exhausted persistence. The smell of the trail was distinct, a heavy mixture of wet wool, sweating animals, and the sharp scent of coffee boiling over open fires. It was a tactile world, where every mile was measured in the vibration of the wagon frame and the ache of walking. For most did walk. To ride in the wagon was to tax the oxen, and the oxen were the engine of survival. The pace of this migration was agonizingly slow. A good day meant 12, perhaps 15 miles. It was a speed determined entirely by the biology of the ox. These animals were not built for speed, but for endurance, plodding forward with a heavy, swaying gait that became the metronome of the entire summer. The travelers fell into a trance-like state, matching their steps to the slow, rhythmic clatter of the hooves. There was no rushing the horizon. The mountains in the distance seemed to retreat as the wagons advanced, creating a sense of motion without progress. The anxiety of the trail was not about gold, but about grass and water. The daily calculation was simple, but unforgiving. Finding enough forage for the animals before nightfall. The prairie became a chessboard of resources, where a late start could mean arriving at a campsite that had already been grazed bare by the vanguard. Yet, in the evenings, a different kind of society emerged. When the wagons circled and the fires were lit, the vastness of the plains shrank down to the intimate circle of the firelight. Here, the camaraderie of the journey took hold. Fiddles were pulled from protective cases, and the sound of folk songs drifted into the empty darkness. Men wrote letters they knew could not be mailed for months, pouring their hopes onto paper while the ink was still fluid. But outside the ring of light, the physical toll was mounting. The animals grew leaner, their ribs showing through dusty hides, wearing down under the relentless friction of the journey. The trail was a test of attrition, stripping away the non-essential, leaving only the bone and the will to continue. As April faded, the first wave of this great land-bound fleet began to push closer to the setting sun. While the overland travelers counted their steps in the dust of the plains, the first great wave of the maritime fleet began to breach the Golden Gate. In May, San Francisco ceased to be a settlement and became a phenomenon. It was a transformation so rapid, so violent in its expansion, that it defied the logic of urban planning. The city that rose from the dunes was not built of brick or stone, but of cotton and hemp. It was a canvas city, a sprawling, chaotic tapestry of tents that climbed the hills and spilled down into the mud of the bay. The architecture was temporary, fluttering in the constant coastal wind. A city that sounded ceaselessly like the luffing of 1,000 sails. In the harbour, a strange and melancholy sight greeted the newcomers. This was the phenomenon of the ghost fleet. As ships dropped anchor, their crews, caught in the same gravitational pull of the goldfields as the passengers, simply walked away. Sailors deserted en masse, leaving captains alone on empty decks. By late May, hundreds of vessels sat abandoned in the water, their rigging rotting in the salt air. A forest of stripped masts bobbing silently in the tide. Some were eventually dragged ashore to serve as hotels or warehouses, their hulls becoming the foundations of the expanding city, but most simply rotted where they floated. A testament to the singular obsession that had gripped the population. For those stepping off the boat, the sensory experience was overwhelming. The quiet fog of January was gone, replaced by a roar of commerce and construction. The air was filled with the sound of hammers striking wood, of mules struggling through the deep, sucking mud of the unpaved street, and of a dozen languages shouting for attention. It was a place of raw exposure, where the streets were so treacherous that stories circulated of men drowning in the mire of Montgomery Street, pulled down by the weight of their own supplies. And then there was the shock of the market. In the stable economies of the East, a man knew the value of $1. In San Francisco, that knowledge was worthless. We arrive here at the price anchor of the simple breakfast. In New York, a dozen eggs might cost 15 cents. In the chaotic market of San Francisco, a single egg, often of questionable freshness, commanded a price of $1. That single coin represented a full day's wage for a laborer back home. A loaf of bread, the most basic sustenance of life, became a luxury item. This was hyperinflation driven by absolute scarcity. There were thousands of hungry mouths and almost no chickens. The new arrivals stood in the mud, holding their devalued currency, realizing that the gold they had come to find was already being siphoned away by the simple cost of staying alive. Finding a place to rest was equally ruinous. With no hotels to speak of, lodging became a matter of improvisation. A lucky man might pay an exorbitant fee to sleep on a billiard table in a crowded saloon, curled up amidst the smell of stale tobacco and spilled ale. Most slept in the open, or huddled under thin blankets in the brush, subjected to the relentless wind that drove the sand into everything. The sand was a constant companion. It gritted between teeth, settled into coffee, and coated the skin in a fine, abrasive layer. It was a city of discomfort, a transit point where no one intended to stay. Yet everyone was trapped by the logistics of moving inland. But the city was not the destination. It was merely the toll booth. As May turned to June, the eyes of the crowd turned away from the bay and toward the river, where the true labor was waiting to begin, leaving the chaotic mud of the coast. The movement now funneled inland, following the arteries of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. The journey from the bay to the foothills was a transition from the cool, foggy, maritime climate into the baking reality of the interior valley. Men crowded onto overcrowded riverboats, the paddle wheels churning the muddy water, or walked alongside heavily laden mule teams that kicked up clouds of fine, choking soil. The air here was different, still, hot, and smelling of dry grass and heated oak. The noise of the city faded, replaced by the creaking of leather harnesses and the constant, low-level anxiety of getting to the gold before it was gone. In these remote outposts, the familiar currency of the civilized world dissolved. There were few coins to be found. Silver and paper money were useless abstractions in the wilderness. In their place, a new economy emerged, built entirely on the weight of the earth itself. This was the era of the pinch. Gold dust became the primary medium of exchange. To pay for a drink or a meal, a miner would open his leather pouch, and the merchant would reach in with a thumb and forefinger to take a pinch of dust. It was an inexact science, a transaction based on the size of a man's hand and the honesty of the grip. A pinch was generally understood to equal $1, but in the rough commerce of the camps, the exchange was as fluid as the river water. To hold raw gold is a specific sensory experience that defies the imagination of those who have only seen jewelry. It is not the smooth, cold metal of a wedding band. It is heavy, impossibly heavy for its size, sitting in the palm like a dense anchor. It has a texture, gritty and irregular, often mixed with black sand. Miners carried it in buckskin pouches, chamois bags that became soft and dark with oil and sweat over time. The sound of a heavy pouch thumping onto a wooden counter became the definitive sound of success, a dull, solid impact that spoke louder than any boast. Yet, those who listened closely to the rhythm of the camps soon realized that the true wealth was not being made in the water, but behind the counter. The rise of the merchant class was swift and absolute. These shrewd operators understood that while gold was a gamble, the need for supplies was a certainty. They set up canvas stores and rough-hewn log cabins, stocking them with goods shipped at great expense from the coast. They became the gatekeepers of survival, turning the miners' labor into their own profit without ever wetting a boot in the stream. Let us consider the tin pan. In a hardware store in Boston, a simple stamped metal pan might cost 20 cents. It was a throwaway item, used for feeding chickens or peeling potatoes. But in the Sierra foothills in June of 1849, that same pan was the essential tool of extraction, the only barrier between poverty and fortune. The price skyrocketed to $8, $10, sometimes $15. Men paid it without blinking, handing over weeks of previous wages for a circle of cheap tin, because without it, they were powerless. The inflation was not just about greed. It was about the desperate utility of the object. The landscape itself began to bear the scars of this desperation. The pristine riverbanks we observed in January, those quiet cathedrals of stone and water, were now unrecognizable. The earth was turned inside out. Piles of gravel, known as tailings, rose like strange grey dunes along the water's edge. The clear streams turned cloudy with silt, the water choking on the debris of 10,000 shovels. The natural order was being dismantled, rock by rock, in a frantic search for the heavy yellow dust. As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the days grew longer, the pleasant warmth of spring began to harden into a relentless, oppressive heat, signaling the arrival of the true Californian summer. July brought the full weight of the Californian summer down upon the camps, stripping away the last vestiges of romantic adventure and replacing them with the crushing monotony of industrial labor. The image of the solitary prospector gently dipping a pan into a stream was by this stage of the year largely a myth. To make the earth yield its treasure required more aggressive machinery and a rhythm of work that bordered on exhaustion. The riverbanks echoed with the sound of the rocker box, a crude wooden cradle that looked deceptively like a piece of nursery furniture. It was a two-man operation, one to shovel the wet gravel into a perforated metal hopper, and another to rock the device back and forth with a violent, rhythmic motion while pouring water over the slurry. The sound was a relentless, wooden clack, swish, clack, swish, a cadence that continued from dawn until dusk, defining the sonic landscape of the diggings. For larger operations, the long tom appeared, a wooden trough 10 to 20 feet long, demanding even more earth to be moved, more water to be carried, and more backs to be bent in service of the flow. The physical sensation of this labor was a study in brutal contrasts. The rivers of the Sierra Nevada are fed by melting snowpack from the high peaks, meaning the water remains shockingly cold even in the height of summer. A miner stood for 12 hours a day with his lower body immersed in freezing currents that numbed the feet and ached in the bones. Yet, the air in the canyons, trapped between steep granite walls that radiated heat, became a furnace. Temperatures frequently soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The miner existed in a state of thermal shock, his legs freezing, while his back and shoulders blistered under the relentless sun. This exposure took a heavy toll. Joints swelled with rheumatism, and skin cracked and bled. Unable to reconcile the freezing wet with the dry, dusty heat. It was a punishment to the body that offered no respite. A physical endurance test that had to be repeated every time the sun rose over the ridges. And for all this effort, the reward was rarely a glittering nugget. The reality of July was flour gold. Dust so fine it looked like a smear of yellow paint. Extracting it required hours of repetitive, mind-numbing motion to separate the heavy specks from the worthless sand. The work was not a treasure hunt. It was a factory job performed in the wilderness. When the light finally failed and the work ceased, the sensory experience shifted to the camp itself. The air grew thick with the blue haze of campfire smoke and the heavy, greasy smell of frying salt pork. The diet was a disastrous cycle of flour, grease, and beans, consumed with a quiet desperation. Fresh vegetables were non-existent in the remote camps, leading to the slow, quiet onset of scurvy. Men found their gums bleeding and their energy fading, their bodies starving for a simple onion or a potato, items that were now worth their weight in the very dust they were digging for. There was, however, a specific moment of silence unique to July. In the heat of the day, when the sun was directly overhead, the canyon often became too hot for labor. The shovels stopped. The rockers ceased their clatter. Men retreated to the shade of the scrub oaks or their canvas tents, lying still in the oppressive warmth. For an hour or two, the river reclaimed its voice, the sound of the water rising above the industry of men. It was a heavy, lethargic silence, a pause in the great machine, where the only movement was the shimmering of heat waves rising from the white granite rocks. As the sun dipped below the canyon walls, signaling the end of the labor we observed in July, the mining camps underwent a nightly transformation. The silence of the workday gave way to the noise of the evening, revealing the desperate economy of leisure. By August, the miners were not just exhausted physically, they were starved for distraction. The gambling hall became the center of social gravity. Often these were nothing more than large canvas tents with dirt floors, illuminated by the smoky, flickering glow of tallow candles stuck into the necks of empty bottles. Inside, the air was thick and close, smelling of unwashed wool, damp earth, and stale tobacco. Men crowded around rough plank tables to play Monte or Faro, betting the dust they had spent all day collecting on the turn of a single card. It was a way to feel something other than the ache of the shovel, a quick injection of adrenaline to break the monotony of survival. In this atmosphere of seeking relief, alcohol became a liquid currency with its own inflated exchange rate. We arrive here at the price anchor of whiskey. In 1849 California, the quality of spirits was notoriously poor, often little more than raw alcohol, colored with burnt sugar or tobacco juice to mimic the look of aged bourbon. Yet, a single glass of this rot gut could cost 50 cents or $1, the equivalent of a half day's wage in the stable markets of the East. A bottle might trade for an ounce of gold, $16 in the currency of the time. Men paid it willingly. They were buying not just the drink, but the momentary warmth it provided against the chill of the high-altitude night and the crushing isolation of the wilderness. But there was a commodity far more valuable than whiskey, one that men would walk miles to obtain. This was the arrival of the mail. When a rider or a wagon appeared with news from the coast, work stopped. The line for the post office, often just a window cut into the side of a general store, would stretch for hundreds of yards down the dusty trail. Men stood for hours, waiting with a patience they rarely showed for anything else. To receive a letter was to hold a physical piece of the life left behind. A sheet of paper, worn thin from travel and covered in familiar handwriting, was a lifeline. It was a tactile reminder that they still existed in the memory of a wife or a mother thousands of miles away. Those who received nothing would turn away in a silence that was heavy and profound, walking back to their tents alone in the dark. The camps themselves had become a global tapestry by late summer. The initial wave of Americans was now joined by thousands from around the world. There were Chileans and Peruvians, experienced miners who brought techniques from the Andes. There were Frenchmen, Australians, and the first arrivals from China. Walking through a large camp in August was an auditory journey through the world's languages, a babel of voices arguing, singing, and bargaining in the remote Californian twilight. Yet, over everything, the season began to lay its heavy blanket. The late summer in the Sierra foothills is defined by dryness. The green grass of spring had long since burned to a crisp, golden straw. The dust was omnipresent. It was a fine, brown powder that coated the canvas tents, the leaves of the oak trees, and the faces of the men. It settled into the food and the bedding, a constant, gritty reminder of the earth they were fighting against. As August faded, the nights grew longer and sharper. The sounds of the camp, the scrape of a fiddle playing a lonely tune, the murmur of a dispute over a card game, the rustle of the wind in the dry pines, seemed to carry further in the cooling air. The frenetic energy of the summer was beginning to wane, and the first subtle hints of the changing season began to drift down from the high peaks. By September, the chaotic scramble began to congeal into something resembling a society. The early days of first come, first served were evolving into a complex system of unwritten statutes. In the absence of federal judges or sheriffs, the miners created their own governance, establishing the mining codes. These were a patchwork of local laws that defined exactly how many feet of riverbank a man could claim and what labor was required to hold it. These were not abstract legal theories written in leather-bound books. They were practical rules born of necessity, measured in paces along the gravel bars and marked with wooden stakes driven into the rocky soil. The silence of the wilderness was now punctuated by the sound of boundaries being drawn, a geometric imposition of order upon the chaotic landscape. When disputes arose, and they always did in a land where a foot of ground could mean the difference between poverty and fortune, justice was swift and informal. The miners' court was not a building with marble pillars, but a gathering under a large oak tree or in the center of a dusty street. A jury would be selected from the crowd, the arguments heard in the open air, and the verdict delivered before the sun went down. It was a rough, immediate form of democracy, enforcing order through the collective will of the camp. Yet, we must acknowledge the shadow that lay over this new order. As these boundaries expanded, they pushed with relentless force against the populations that had lived in these valleys for thousands of years. The displacement of the indigenous peoples was often quiet in the historical record, treated as an inevitability by the new arrivals, but it was profound in its impact. A steady, forceful erasing of one way of life to make room for another. The smoke of the mining camps rose where ancient villages had once stood, a silent testament to the heavy cost of this new civilization. Visually, the camps were changing. The flimsy canvas that had defined the ragtowns of spring began to give way to the solidity of timber. The sound of the saw became as common as the sound of the shovel. Rough-hewn cabins replaced tents, and in the growing towns, false-fronted buildings rose to mimic the architecture of the East. These structures were still raw. The wood was green and smelled of sap, but they signaled an intention to stay. The transient camp was becoming a settlement, anchored to the earth by iron nails and heavy beams. The economy, too, was finding its rhythm. The frantic scarcity of the early months began to ease as the supply chains stabilized. The mule trains became regular, arriving with predictable cadence. Shelves that had once been empty now held bolts of cloth, barrels of pickled vegetables, and tools of better quality. The panic of survival softened into the routine of living. And with this stabilization came the subtle shift of the season. September in the foothills brings a distinct change in the light. The fierce, white glare of summer softens into a golden haze. The shadows grow longer earlier in the day. The heat still lingers in the afternoon, but the nights begin to carry a warning chill, a crispness that whispers of the winter to come. The water in the river seemed to run a little darker, a little colder, reminding every man standing knee-deep in the current that the easy days were ending. The urgency was no longer just about greed. It was about preparation. The window for work was closing, and the sky was beginning to turn. As the calendar turned to October, the psychological atmosphere of the camps underwent a profound shift. The frantic, gold-drunk energy of the summer evaporated, replaced by a primal, gnawing urgency. The miners, many of whom were new to the region, began to hear stories from the old-timers, the few who had lived through a California winter. They spoke of the rainy season, not as a weather event, but as a siege. The sun, which had been a relentless tyrant for 5 months, now became a fleeing friend. The days grew noticeably shorter, the shadows stretching across the canyons by mid-afternoon, bringing with them a biting chill that did not lift until late morning. The golden landscape of dry grass began to look less like a treasure and more like tinder, waiting for the moisture that would turn it all to mud. This anticipation of the wet drove a new economic reality. The price of luxury goods collapsed, while the cost of survival gear began its vertical ascent. We arrive now at the price anchor of the season: boots and blankets. In the dry heat of July, a man could work in broken shoes or even bare feet, and a thin cotton shirt was sufficient for the night. But in October, the prospect of freezing rain changed the value of everything. A pair of sturdy leather boots, greased to repel water and reaching the knee, became the most coveted object in the mountains. Prices soared to $50, sometimes $100, an immense fortune for footwear. Wool blankets, heavy and scratchy, were traded with the seriousness of land deeds. To face the winter without warm wool was to invite pneumonia, which in the remote camps was often a death sentence. The market had shifted from the tools of extraction to the tools of preservation. Simultaneously, a great geographical retreat began. The High Sierra, the jagged granite peaks that held the source of the gold, became a place of danger. The memory of the Donner Party, trapped in the snows only 3 years prior, was fresh in the collective consciousness. No one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of the snow line. And so, the trails that had been clogged with men marching upward in the spring were now filled with a reverse migration. Miners abandoned their high-altitude claims, carrying their tools and meager winnings back down toward the foothills and the river valleys. It was a somber procession, a retreat from the fortress of nature before the gates slammed shut. In the lower camps, the mood was one of frantic fortification. The sound of the rocker box was replaced by the sound of the axe. Men worked to reinforce their canvas tents with timber frames, or to build log cabins chinked with mud and moss. Firewood was gathered with obsessive compulsion, stacked in high cords against the walls of the new shelters. The general stores were emptied of flour and beans, not for immediate consumption, but for stockpiling. The fear of the roads becoming impassable drove men to hoard sacks of grain, stacking them in corners like sandbags against a flood. The light itself seemed to change texture. The crisp, high-definition visibility of the summer softened into a permanent, slate-grey haze. The wind shifted, blowing now from the south and west, carrying the heavy, metallic scent of the ocean and the incoming storm systems. The birds grew quiet or departed. The buzzing of insects faded. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the first drop to fall. The gold was still there, hidden in the gravel, but the earth was about to reclaim its privacy. The time for seeking was over. The time for enduring had begun. The sky lowered, heavy and impenetrable, and the first damp gusts rattled the dry leaves of the oaks, signaling that the window of preparation was closed. And then, the sky finally broke. The tension of October dissolved into the relentless reality of November. The rains did not come as a refreshing shower, but as a deluge that seemed determined to wash the intruders off the face of the continent. In the cities and the camps alike, the defining element of life ceased to be gold. It became mud. In San Francisco, the transformation was catastrophic. The streets, which had been dusty thoroughfares a month prior, dissolved into a thick, adhesive slurry. This was not the mud of a garden path. It was a consuming force, a deep, sucking clay that swallowed boots, cartwheels, and even livestock. Stories circulated of mules drowning in the middle of Montgomery Street, pulled down by the weight of their packs into the mire. Commerce ground to a halt. The frantic energy of the summer market was paused by the simple physics of friction. Wagons could not move. The city became an archipelago of wooden planks and crates thrown down to create pathways, men hopping from island to island to avoid the brown rivers that flowed between the tents. Signs appeared in the mire with dark humor, warning travelers of the depth, as the very ground they stood on became the enemy. Up in the mining camps, the rain brought a profound isolation. The dry creek beds, which had served as roads all summer, roared back to life as dangerous torrents. The trails turned to soup, cutting off the supply lines from the coast. A camp that had been a bustling hub of trade in August was now a lonely island in a sea of wet pine. The world shrank. A miner's universe was no longer the miles of river he could prospect, but the few square feet of dry ground inside his shelter. The camaraderie of the campfire was replaced by the solitude of the cabin. Life moved indoors. The sound of November was the relentless drumming of water on tight canvas, a noise that was deafening at first, then maddening, and finally just a constant rhythmic backdrop to existence. Inside the tents and cabins, the air grew heavy and still. Everything was damp. Clothes never truly dried. They just cycled between wet and moist. The smell of the camps changed from the sharp scent of pine smoke to the musty, organic odor of wet wool, molding leather, and damp earth. The work of mining stopped. The days were spent on the small, quiet tasks of maintenance. Men sat by sputtering fires, mending the tears in their trousers with clumsy, cold fingers. They wrote long entries in their journals, the ink taking hours to dry in the humid air. They slept for 12, 14 hours a day, not out of exhaustion, but out of boredom. It was a hibernation, a forced pause imposed by the weather. The diet, too, regressed. The fresh venison and occasional vegetables of the autumn vanished. The miners returned to the iron rations they had carried across the plains. The barrels of salt pork and sacks of dried beans. Meals became a grey, salty routine, eaten in the dim light of the afternoon dark gloom. The connection to the outside world was severed. No mail wagons could navigate the sludge of the valley floor. November was a month of waiting. A long grey corridor of time where the ambition of the gold rush was smothered under a heavy, wet blanket of rain. The year was slowly dying, not with a dramatic finale, but with a slow, quiet drowning of the landscape. As the relentless rains of November finally turned to the silence of snow in the high country, the year 1849 drew to its quiet close. December arrived not with a fanfare, but with a deep, muffled stillness that softened the harsh edges of the mining camps. In the cabins and reinforced tents, the arrival of Christmas was marked not by commercial spectacle, but by a profound, aching nostalgia. There were no grand feasts here. Instead, the holiday was celebrated with small, heartbreaking gestures of civilization preserved in the wilderness. A single bottle of brandy, saved for months against the temptation of despair, was opened and shared in thimble-sized portions. A handful of dried apples, soaked in water to simulate freshness, became a rare delicacy. Men who had been strangers in January now sat shoulder to shoulder near the hearth, singing hymns in German, French, and English, their voices drifting out into the cold, starry void of the Sierra night. It was a moment to remember who they had been before the gold fever took hold. With the closing of the year came the inevitable review of the ledger. For the vast majority of the 49ers, the grand gamble had not paid off in the way they had dreamed. The mother lode remained elusive. Most miners looked at their leather pouches of dust and realized they had barely broken even against the exorbitant costs of survival. They had traded a year of their lives, their health, and their comfort for a modest sum that would vanish quickly in the inflated economy of the West. The realization settled in that mining was not a lottery, but an industry, a hard, grinding trade where the earth yielded its wealth only with immense reluctance. The dream of easy fortune had been washed away by the reality of the river, leaving behind a hardened, pragmatic understanding of labor. Yet, while individual fortunes were mixed, the collective reality had been irrevocably altered. In the span of 12 months, a sleepy, remote territory had birthed a political giant. The machinery of statehood was already grinding into motion. The chaotic meetings of the mining camps were evolving into a formal government, and the makeshift codes of the river were hardening into law. California was no longer a distant outpost on the edge of the map. It was becoming a center of gravity. The sheer weight of humanity that had poured into the region had forced the creation of a new society, one built on the foundations of gold and ambition, ready to challenge the established powers of the East. The landscape itself lay resting under the winter sky, forever changed. The pristine rivers of the previous winter were now dammed and diverted. The ancient forests had been thinned to build the towns. But in December, the snow performed an act of grace, covering the piles of grey tailings and the muddy scars of the diggings. The mountains reclaimed their dignity, hiding the evidence of the frantic scratching of men under a smooth white shroud. From a macroeconomic perspective, the year ended with a shift in the global axis. The trade routes of the world had been redrawn. Ships that once sailed only the Atlantic now crowded the Pacific. The global economy had tilted westward, pulling capital and labor toward the Golden Gate. The silence of the isolation was gone, replaced by the permanent hum of connection. And so, the year fades. The timeline completes its cycle. The chaos of the rush settles into history. But to truly understand this world, we must step out of the broad sweep of time and into the specific, sensory reality of a single moment. We must leave the year behind and enter the day. We drift now from the general to the particular, settling into the boots of the men who lived it. Let us settle now into the grey, quiet light of a Sierra dawn. The date is forgotten. The specific year has dissolved into the routine of the river. All that exists is the immediate, tactile reality of the morning. You are lying on a bed of pine boughs, their needles pressed flat under a rough wool blanket. The air inside the canvas tent is still and incredibly cold, holding the chill of the high-altitude night. There is a smell here that defines your existence, a mixture of damp earth, old wood smoke trapped in the fabric of the tent, and the sharp, resinous scent of the pine forest outside. The first movement of the day is not a leap, but a slow, stiff uncoiling. Your body is a map of yesterday's labor. The lower back is tight, a dull ache that never truly leaves. The hands, resting on the wool, are swollen, the knuckles enlarged from the constant exposure to freezing water. You sit up, and your breath blooms in the air before you. A small white cloud of life in the dimness. The ritual of dressing is performed in the dark. You reach for your boots. The leather is stiff and cold, resisting the shape of your foot until the warmth of your skin begins to soften it. These boots are your most valuable possession, the barrier between you and the mud, and lacing them up is a slow, deliberate process. You pull on a heavy flannel shirt, the fabric thick and comforting, and step out through the tent flap into the world. The camp is quiet. A few other fires are starting to crackle, sending thin pillars of blue smoke up into the pale sky. The ground beneath your feet is hard, frozen by the night, crunching softly as you walk towards the river. The sound of the water grows louder with every step, a constant, rushing white noise that is the soundtrack to every waking moment. It is the sound of opportunity, but also the sound of the adversary. You reach your claim, a small stretch of gravel bar marked by 4 wooden stakes. The sun has not yet crested the canyon walls. The river lies in shadow, looking like a ribbon of dark glass. You pick up your shovel. The handle is smooth, polished by the friction of your palms over countless hours. You step into the water. The sensation is immediate and shocking. The water of the American River is essentially melted snow, flowing down from the high peaks. It grips your ankles with a biting, numbing cold that cuts through the leather of your boots. It is a cold that wakes every nerve ending. A sharp reminder of the physical cost of this pursuit. You plant your feet in the gravel, finding a stable stance against the current. Let us find the rhythm of the work. Mining is not a frantic scramble. It is a slow, hypnotic cadence. It requires a patience that matches the geological time of the river itself. Allow your breathing to slow down now. Match your breath to the motion of the work. Inhale slowly, deeply, as you drive the shovel into the wet, heavy gravel. Feel the resistance of the earth. Hold the breath for a moment as you lift the weight, the wet stones sliding against the steel. Exhale long and slow as you deposit the earth into the rocker box or the pan. Inhale again, drawing the cool mountain air into your lungs, resetting the body. Exhale, letting the tension in your shoulders drop as you bend once more. This is the cycle. Scoop, lift, pour, repeat. It is a meditation of movement. If you are using a pan, the rhythm shifts. You crouch at the water's edge, the metal pan heavy with sediment. You dip it beneath the surface, and the water swirls in. Now, the motion becomes circular, gentle. You are mimicking the river, using water to separate the heavy from the light. Listen to the sound. Swish, swish, splash. The gravel grinds against the tin bottom of the pan. A harsh, scratching sound. As the lighter sand washes away, the sound changes. It becomes softer. You're looking for color, but mostly you are watching the physics of the earth. The black sand stays. The quartz tumbles out. The water creates a small vortex, a miniature storm in your hands. The sun finally climbs over the ridge, and the temperature shifts dramatically. The air in the canyon begins to heat up, trapped between the stone walls. Now, you exist in a state of thermal contradiction. Your feet and hands are submerged in freezing water, numb and pale, while the back of your neck burns under the intense, high-altitude sun. You pause to wipe sweat from your forehead with a cold, wet hand. A moment of sensory confusion that defines the miner's day. Midday arrives not by a clock, but by the position of the sun and the hunger in your stomach. You retreat to the shade of a scrub oak for the noon meal. It is a simple, austere affair. You take a piece of hardtack, a dense, dry biscuit that tastes of flour and nothing else. You might dip it in coffee to soften it, the bitter, black liquid warming your throat. There is perhaps a strip of dried beef, salty and tough, requiring long, thoughtful chewing. This pause is silent. You look at the river, not as a worker, but as a witness. You see the dragonflies hovering over the eddies. You see the way the light catches the mica in the rocks, sparking with false hope. You feel the heavy, lethargic fatigue in your arms, the specific tiredness that comes from moving weight. It is an honest exhaustion, devoid of anxiety, grounded entirely in the physical world. The afternoon stretches out, long and golden. The work resumes. The rhythm returns. Inhale, dig, exhale, wash. Monotony is the true challenge. Mind wanders, drifting back to the life left behind. The green fields of Ohio, the cobbled streets of Boston, the faces of family. But the river always pulls you back. The water demands attention. Every pan could be the one. Every shovel of dirt holds a secret that has been kept for 1,000,000 years, waiting for this specific moment to be revealed. As the light begins to fail, turning the canyon walls to a deep, bruised purple, the temperature drops instantly. The heat of the day evaporates, replaced by the returning chill. You straighten up, your spine cracking audibly. You rinse the tools, the metal gleaming wet in the twilight. You step out of the river, your boots heavy and sodden, and begin the walk back to the camp. The smell of the evening is different. It is the smell of wood smoke and frying pork, the scent of survival. You reach your tent, the canvas glowing faintly from the lantern inside. You sit on a log, peeling off the wet boots, feeling the blood return to your feet in a painful, prickling rush. You are tired. A deep, cellular fatigue that makes your limbs feel heavy as lead. But as you sit there, watching the stars emerge in the narrow strip of sky above the canyon, there is a quiet peace. You have wrestled with the earth. You have stood in the flow of history. The gold is elusive, perhaps even absent, but the day itself was real. The cold water, the hot sun, the heavy stone, the rhythmic breath. These are the truths of 1849. You crawl back onto the pine boughs, pulling the wool blanket up to your chin, and close your eyes. The sound of the river following you down into the deep, dreamless sleep of the exhausted. We leave the river now. We step away from the rushing water, the cold wetness of the gravel, and the biting wind of the canyon floor. We move toward the town, or what passes for a town in this remote valley. We are entering a different domain, one defined not by the extraction of raw earth, but by the careful, quiet administration of goods. We are stepping into the life of the merchant. The sensory transition is immediate. You step through the open door of the supply store, and the world changes. The harsh, bright glare of the California sun is cut off, replaced by a dim, amber-colored twilight. The air here is different. It is dry, still, and incredibly rich with scent. While the river smelled of pine and wet stone, the store smells of the entire world condensed into a single room. Take a moment to inhale this atmosphere. It is a complex, comforting perfume. There is the deep, roasted bitterness of coffee beans, sitting in open burlap sacks imported from Brazil. There is the sweet, heavy scent of molasses and brown sugar, thick and cloying in the heat. There is the sharp, medicinal tang of tobacco, twisted into dark ropes. And underneath it all, the dry, fibrous smell of canvas and new rope, the smell of potential and preparation. You are standing behind the counter. This is your fortress. It is a wide, sturdy slab of planed oak, worn smooth by the elbows of 1,000 customers and the sliding of countless goods. Unlike the miner, whose body is constantly in motion, your existence is one of stillness and observation. You are the anchor point in a spinning world. Your posture is upright, calm, waiting. The store is quiet in the mid-morning. The miners are at the river. Dust motes dance in the shafts of light that pierce through the gaps in the wooden walls, swirling in slow, lazy circles. You take this time to organize the inventory. This is a tactile pleasure. You run your hands over the tools arranged on the shelf. The cold, smooth iron of the pickaxe heads, the rough, wooden handles of the shovels. You adjust the stack of wool blankets, feeling the scratchy, lanolin-rich fabric that will save a man's life in January. Everything here has a purpose. Everything here is a tool for survival. A customer enters. The light from the doorway is momentarily blocked by a silhouette. It is a miner, still wet from the river, his boots caked in mud. He brings the outside in with him, the smell of sweat and damp earth. He approaches the counter, moving with the heavy, tired gait of a man who has been moving rocks since dawn. He places a list on the counter. Or perhaps he just points. He needs flour. He needs nails. He needs a new tin pan. You move with efficiency. You do not rush. You scoop the flour from the barrel, the white powder rising in a small cloud, and pour it into a sack. You weigh it, not with the obsessive precision of gold, but with the practiced eye of provision. You place the items on the wood, a heavy thud for the nails, a soft rustle for the flour, and now the payment. The miner does not reach for a wallet. He reaches for the leather pouch at his belt. This is the ritual of the transaction, the defining moment of the economy of 1849. Let us slow down for this. This is a moment of balance. The miner loosens the drawstring of the buckskin bag. He opens it, revealing the dull, yellow dust inside. You bring out the scales. They are a delicate instrument of brass, sitting on a wooden base. They are the judge and the jury of this transaction. You place a small weight on one side of the balance. It is a tiny piece of brass, stamped with a number. The miner tilts his pouch. He taps the side of it gently with his forefinger. Tap, tap, tap. The gold dust falls like heavy sand into the brass pan. It makes a soft, shushing sound, like sugar pouring onto glass. Let us match our breathing to the settling of the scale. This requires absolute stillness. Inhale slowly, watching the needle of the scale begin to rise. Hold a breath as the brass pans tremble, seeking their equilibrium. Exhale gently, watching the movement slow, the needle shivering as it finds the center. Inhale again, a deep, steadying breath, acknowledging the weight of the labor sitting in that pan. Exhale, nodding your head. The balance is true. You take a small brush, sweeping the dust from the scale into your own strongbox. The transaction is complete. There is no haggling here. The prices are high. Everyone knows this. But the need is absolute. The miner nods, gathers his goods, and turns to leave. The door opens. The bright light floods in for a second, and then he is gone. The silence returns. You turn to the ledger. This is the intellectual anchor of your day. You open the heavy book, the spine cracking softly. The pages are thick, cream-colored paper, ruled with faint blue lines. You dip your quill into the inkwell. The ink is black and viscous. Writing in the ledger is a sensory experience of its own. The quill scratches against the roughness of the paper. A dry, rhythmic scritch-scratch that marks the passage of time. You record the date. You record the sale. You record the name. In a world of transience, where men change their names or disappear into the mountains never to be seen again, your ledger is one of the few places where they are remembered. You are the historian of the camp's commerce. You write with a steady hand, the letters forming in elegant, looping script. A small act of order in a chaotic wilderness. The afternoon wears on. The heat builds, but inside the store, it remains bearable. The smells intensify in the warmth, the molasses becoming sweeter, the pine pitch in the walls becoming more pungent. You might take a moment to sit on a stool, resting your back against the shelves. You listen to the sounds of the town outside, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the bark of a dog, the rumble of a wagon wheel. But you are separate from it. You are the keeper of the supplies. As evening approaches, the rush comes. Miners returning from the river stop by for their evening needs. Tobacco for the pipe, whiskey for the cold, salt pork for the pan. The store fills with voices, a low murmur of conversation. Men lean against your counter, not just to buy, but to talk. You are the confessor, the newsbearer, the neutral ground. They tell you about the color they found, or the color they didn't. You listen, you nod, you weigh the dust. You offer a word of encouragement or a simple acknowledgement of the hardship. You are the steady presence they rely on. Finally, the sun sets. The town grows dark. It is time to close. The ritual of closing is as important as the opening. You sweep the floor, the broom bristling against the rough planks, pushing the day's dust out the door. You check the barrels. You cover the cheese with a cloth. You wipe down the counter, removing the few stray grains of gold and flour. You walk to the door. You look out one last time at the camp, seeing the fires springing up in the darkness, the orange glow against the blue night. You step back and close the heavy wooden door. You slide the bar across, a solid, heavy thunk of timber against timber. Now, you are alone in the dark, surrounded by the inventory. The silence is absolute. It is a heavy, protected silence. You can smell the coffee and the canvas, even stronger now in the dark. You feel the presence of the goods, stacks of potential energy waiting for the morning. You walk to the back room, to your small cot. You are not exhausted in the body like the miner, but your mind is tired from the constant calculation, the constant balancing of the scales. You sit on the edge of the bed. You take a deep breath, inhaling the dry, spicy air of your domain. You are the merchant. You have survived another day of the rush, not by gambling on the river, but by standing firm on the dry ground, holding the keys to the things men need. You lie down, the ledger closed on the desk nearby, the gold locked safely in the box, and drift into a quiet, calculated sleep. We leave the quiet, enclosed order of the merchant store and step back out into the darkening air of the valley. We move away from the ledger and the scale, away from the calculations of profit and loss, and approach the elemental heart of the camp. We are moving toward the light. We are stepping into the boots of the camp cook. This is not a role of professional culinary skill. There are no white aprons here, no copper pans gleaming in a well-lit kitchen. You are likely a miner taking your turn at the rotation, or perhaps an older man whose back can no longer tolerate the bent posture of the river, but whose hands are still steady enough to feed the crew. Your domain is not a room, but a circle of illuminated ground carved out of the wilderness. Your stove is the earth itself. The sensory transition here is dominated by temperature. You stand before the fire, the only point of warmth in a landscape that is rapidly surrendering to the chill of the night. On your face, you feel the intense, dry heat of the burning oak logs, a sensation that prickles the skin and flushes the cheeks. On your back, the cold air of the Sierra night presses in, a heavy, invisible weight. You exist on the boundary between civilization and the wild, constantly turning to warm one side and then the other, a human rotisserie in the wilderness. The fire is your responsibility. It is not just a tool for cooking. It is the psychological anchor of the camp. You tend it with a specific, practiced care. You are not throwing wood on haphazardly. You are building a structure of heat. You choose the fuel with intention. Dry pine for a quick, snapping light to boil the water. Dense oak to create the slow, glowing bed of coals needed for the baking. Let us focus on the sound of the fire. It is a living thing. There is the sharp pop of a sap pocket exploding in the pine, sending a shower of orange sparks drifting up into the darkness. There is the low, steady hiss of moisture evaporating from the greener wood. There is the deep, crumbling sound of a log collapsing into the bed of embers, shifting the architecture of the light. Your hands are covered in soot and ash. It works into the cracks of your skin, a permanent grey map of your labour. You reach for the heavy cast iron pot, the Dutch oven, which has been burying its weight in the coals. Inside, the evening meal is reaching its completion. The menu does not change. It is the trinity of 1849: salt pork, beans, and bread. But to cook it is an act of alchemy. You have spent hours earlier in the day soaking the beans, washing away the grit of travel. You have sliced the salt pork, the white fat gleaming in the twilight, and rendered it down in the skillet until it is nothing but liquid gold and crispy remnants. Now, the smell rising from the pot is the most powerful force in the camp. Inhale that scent. It is heavy, rich, and savory. It smells of rendered fat, of wood smoke, of caramelized molasses, and the earthy, starchy aroma of slow-cooked beans. To a starving man who has spent 12 hours in freezing water, this smell is more valuable than the gold dust in his pouch. Let us find a breathing cadence here, in the quiet moment before the men return. The pot is bubbling gently. The fire is steady. You have a moment of stillness. Inhale slowly, drawing the warm, smoky air deep into your chest. Hold the breath, watching the orange light dance on the black iron of the pot. Exhale long and slow, releasing the tension of the day, letting your shoulders drop away from your ears. Inhale again, smelling the pine resin and the coffee beginning to percolate. Exhale, grounding yourself in the warmth of the hearth. The preparation of the bread is a tactile ritual. You do not have yeast. You have sourdough starter, a living culture carried in a crock or a tin, bubbling and smelling of fermentation. You mix it with flour and water in a tin basin. The dough is sticky, elastic, fighting against your fingers. You work it, kneading it against the side of the basin, feeling the resistance. You form it into a round loaf and place it in the heated oven, covering it with the heavy iron lid and piling fresh coals on top. You are baking by instinct, judging the temperature by the glow of the embers and the smell of the crust browning. Now, the camp comes alive. The miners return from the river. You hear the heavy tread of wet boots on the hard ground, the clatter of tools being dropped, the weary groans of men sitting down. They gather around your fire. This is the moment where your labor pays off. You are the provider. You take the ladle, a simple tin spoon with a long handle. and you begin to serve. The sound of the meal is distinctive. It is the clink-scrape of tin spoons on tin plates. It is the sound of hungry men eating with focus. There is very little conversation at first. The need for calories overrides the need for words. You watch them eat. You watch the steam rising from the plates in the cold air. You see the tension leave their faces as the warm food hits their stomachs. You pour the coffee, thick and black, into tin mugs. It is boiling hot, scalding the tongue, but the heat is welcome. As the meal finishes, the atmosphere shifts. The frantic energy of the day dissipates. The men lean back against their saddles or log stumps. Pipes are lit, adding the sweet, pungent smell of tobacco to the wood smoke. Voices drop to a low murmur. They talk of the day's find, of the weather, of home. You sit with them, your own plate on your knee, but your mind is already on the next task. The cleanup is the final hurdle of the day. There is no sink, no tap, no soap. You gather the plates, now slick with grease and bean juice. You walk to the edge of the firelight, to where a bucket of river water sits. You use the elements of the earth to clean. You grab a handful of clean river sand. This is your abrasive. You scour the tin plates with the sand and the cold water, the grit cutting through the grease. It is a rhythmic, circular motion. Scrub, rinse, stack. Scrub, rinse, stack. The water in the bucket turns dark and murky. Your hands, briefly warm from the fire, grow cold again. When the last plate is dried with a rough flour sack and stacked in the wooden crate, the camp has fallen silent. The men have retreated to their tents. The storytelling is over. The only sound left is the wind moving through the tops of the pine trees, a sound like a distant ocean, and the settling of the fire. You return to the hearth. The flames have died down now. What remains is a bed of pulsing, deep red coals. This is the sleep fire. You do not want it to burn out, nor do you want it to blaze. You bank the coals, covering them with a layer of ash to preserve the heat for the morning. This act, saving the fire, is an act of faith in tomorrow. It ensures that when the dawn comes, there will be a spark to start the coffee. You stand for a moment, looking at the dying glow. The light illuminates only your boots and the ground immediately around you. The rest of the world has vanished into the void of the night. You feel the immense, crushing silence of 1849 California. It is a silence that stretches for hundreds of miles in every direction, broken only by this small circle of warmth you have maintained. You turn away from the embers. You wrap yourself in your blanket, the wool heavy and smelling of the smoke you have stood in for hours. You lie down on the ground, perhaps on a layer of canvas or pine boughs. The ground is hard, but your body is heavy. You close your eyes. The image of the fire remains burnt onto your retina, a lingering orange ghost in the darkness. You listen to the breathing of the camp, the slow, rhythmic inhalation of sleeping men, and you allow your own breath to join the chorus, drifting down into the deep, restorative rest of the wilderness. The year 1849 was defined less by the gold found and more by the quiet endurance of daily life. The rush has faded, but the silence of the hills remains. If this journey into the past brought you peace, subscribe for more quiet history. Allow the final embers to fade and let the deep, heavy darkness hold you safe now.